So I want to introduce myself. My name is Patrick. I lead events and engagement here at Quorum. I have an awesome opportunity to talk to tons of y'all, whether that's through events, our community, Wonk Nation, through our AI Inner Circle. And I'm so grateful that you're joining us here today, because one of the great things about these webinars is not just hearing from our experts, but also the expertise that you can throw out in chat. Also want to give a shout out to my friend Molly, who's in the back end of this webinar. She's the real hero. You'll occasionally see her in the chat. All right, so last week we hosted our first AI Summit, and it was honestly one of my favorite events I've ever hosted. Shout out to you if you attended that or joined the webinar today. But a few big things came up. Like, one of the things that AI is not going to be able to fully automate is relationship building. But if you ask anybody who builds relationships for a living, you'll hear that it's not a passive experience, or relationship building in a professional context is not just something where you can rely on charm. Trust me, I've tried. It's purposeful, it's strategic, it's active, and it's systematic. And so I'm really excited to bring Maggie McKee up on the stage to share what those systems look like that power some of the top public affairs teams, and how AI is making it easier than ever to enable you to be the stakeholder manager you need to be. And so with that, welcome to the stage, Maggie McKee. Maggie, I'll hand it to you to introduce yourself and kick us off.
Hello. Thank you, Patrick. And I would disagree. Patrick, you are full of charm always, and it works on everybody. Hello, everybody. I am Maggie McKee. I am a senior solutions engineer here at Quorum. And what does that mean? That means that I spend a lot of my time working with government affairs professionals across the country. What I am hearing on every single call that I'm on is, what are the challenges that the government affairs and public affairs industry is facing right now? And what's striking to me is how similar these issues are, regardless of size, issue, structure. And I'm really excited today that you have joined Patrick and myself to talk through some of these challenges. But as a senior solutions engineer, what is a challenge without some solutions, right? So today we're going to be talking about how to build a real-time stakeholder intelligence system. And I like to think of this in two different parts. Number one is the preparation. So we've always heard practice makes perfect, but really preparation makes perfect, right? And then we're going to be thinking about the execution of it all. So how can you shift your day-to-day operations to build a strategic stakeholder strategy that works for you? So let's get into it, and let's see how our leading government affairs teams are adapting to a faster moving policy landscape.
All right. Now, one thing I always like to do at the beginning of these webinars is I love to see where folks are joining us from. Because first off, Molly and I have a bet that there's one state that has not been represented yet in a webinar, and we have a bet that that state will show up this year. So in the chat, throw where you're joining us from, what state, what city. We'd love to know. Maggie, you're joining us from Virginia.
I'm putting it in the chat right now. I'm joining everybody from Richmond, Virginia. It is a beautiful sunny day, and could not say the same about the last couple of weeks. So
really though. I'm in DC, and I had to drag my Chihuahua inside because she was like, "I've finally seen the sun. We have to bask in it."
yes.
We got a webinar to do, Gretel. Let's go.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So I'm seeing some folks from Antigua.
Mark. Wow.
LA, Florida, Salt Lake City, Winchester. Love Winchester, one of my favorite cities in Virginia. Jefferson City, Washington, Connecticut, Illinois. All right. Alaska. There we go. That is not the state, but I don't think we've had Alaska yet. That's exciting. All right. Maggie, I'll pass it back over to you to walk through these stakeholder systems.
Yeah, thanks. And welcome everybody in the chat. Feel free to keep that chat going. All right, let's get into it. All right, so I want to start this webinar and this conversation as we all take a deep breath in and we collectively say, holy moly, I thought that we had seen the end of the unprecedented times, right? So These challenges that we're going to talk about, they don't come just from more activity. They come from less stability in the industry. And these challenges change what stakeholder management needs to look like. So I think what we're talking about really resonates with everybody here on this call. And what I want to reference is Quorum's 2025 State of Government Affairs report. So anybody that has read that, some of these statistics will sound familiar, but this is our annual look at the trends that shape advocacy and lobbying. And I'd be interested to know how many of you resonate with some of the statistics that I'm about to share, potentially now even more so as we're in 2026. So first one is that more than 75% of public affairs professionals say that the polarized political climate makes advocacy and lobbying harder, which is up from 64% in 2024. Next, over 52% of respondents of our survey shared that the top challenge that they are facing is impacting your day-to-day being an unstable political landscape. And then last but not least, when asked what will public affairs teams focus on in 2026, 63% of our respondents said explaining why issues matter and building a stronger brand with lawmakers. So I would imagine out of everybody that we have here from all over the US and beyond, I hope that some of y'all feel seen right now. And I think that that's going to make our conversation even more valuable today. So what are challenges without some solutions? So in a year like 2026, we've got a lot of critical milestones ahead. So it is absolutely necessary to lock into that stakeholder mapping strategy now. The problem is that sometimes the data is outdated even faster than the engagement that took place. Most teams recognize that this is an issue, but they assume that it's a workflow issue. It's actually a data architect issue. The map is not broken, it's just disconnected. So as we look ahead to some of these key milestones and moments ahead in 2026 that are going to impact the stakeholder strategy, I want to ask a question to you all. We can just kind of mentally answer and have it on our minds. The question I ask is, as we approach election season, which one of your tier 1 stakeholders have not been contacted in the last 60 days or more? So again, you don't have to put answers in the chat, but it's something to think about. Which tier 1 stakeholders have not been contacted in 60 days or more? As you're thinking about that question, how are you getting that answer? Are you taking several steps to find that answer? Did you immediately think to, oh, where is my master spreadsheet that I can open up to look at my past engagements? And the answer for many is that's the reality, is that there are disjointed systems where this information lives. And again, moving into these critical moments, we need to act a little bit differently. So what does that shift look like? So let's take a few steps back in this exercise. Let's imagine that we did not just spend the last 60 seconds mentally thumbing through spreadsheets or looking at old emails in our inbox or frantically slacking colleagues to figure out who we last met with in the last 60 days. One of the key words that you're going to hear me mention throughout this presentation is query and queryable. If that is a word, I don't know if Merriam-Webster has it officially in the dictionary, but when you can query your information, it becomes so much more advanced and so much more effective. And this is what we are seeing our high-performing teams do differently in this new season of key milestones ahead. So instead of thumbing through our spreadsheets, a query of which lawmakers in our priority states have engaged with our issue areas in, say, the last 90 days. It's a real question that many of our professionals are asking, and it should not take 2-3 hours to find that answer. When you have centralized data that's easily accessible to all members of the team for visibility, you're able to run quick insights and analyze for action. The speed always comes from clarity. It doesn't come from guesswork, right? Although we would all like to say that the institutional knowledge always lives up in our brains. What happens if we win the lottery? You know, it's the million-dollar question. If so-and-so wins the lottery, what does that look like? And so I want to show this image right here just to give us a visual reference of all the data that needs centralizing. So we can look at many of these different elements that most of our teams operate in some sort of capacity. Specifically, I want to draw our constituent contact, so grassroots activists or PAC members. This is kind of an underutilized signal for mapping interest scores. And then as we are moving towards the election season, candidates and challenger information, that's often a key piece of data that many teams skip. And it's critical that this is used to create a day one strategy so that we're removing those gaps post-election. Now let's get into the execution and more so the why behind everything. As we're going through these 5 techniques, I want to draw that the fundamentals have not changed. All right, so a lot of this is going to feel natural to you all. And many of you will even say, hey, I do this and I do this. I think my team does this well. So these 5 techniques are tried and true and proven to work on their own, but I want to talk through how the strategy gets sharper when you centralize data and you're leveraging artificial intelligence. First technique is issue area alignment. So a tag is only as useful as the data behind it. So basic stakeholder tagging is an absolute non-negotiable these days. And where AI comes into the fold is it will immediately sharpen that organizational stakeholders issue alignment and turn it into a workflow that your team can rely on. Now here, the nuances matter. For many complex policy portfolios, a single champion and neutral detractor label could potentially oversimplify the strategy. So take it a step further, and we are running that alignment specific to the issue areas that your organization is prioritizing. Because tagging at a high level, it takes more work, it requires more data to be centralized, but it also means that your outreach is actually calibrated to where they stand, not just a broad issue category. Technique number 2. Anybody taking notes? Team member relationships. So in my experience being on calls with government affairs teams of all sizes, this is the technique that I have seen that many teams actually think that they have figured out, when in reality, most usually have not. So the institutional knowledge loss problem is underestimated. So of course we love if Patrick wins the lottery tomorrow, where does Patrick's knowledge go? And honestly, we don't want to lose that. And so what we're looking at here is facing really critical questions, like a staffer who has built 3 key relationships over 2 years and then they leave. They take that history with them out the door unless it is logged into a system. And a best practice I'm going to share with you all is to survey your stakeholder network. This is the lowest hanging fruit. Make the most out of your stakeholder relationships and the relationships that they have. It's a quick win, and stakeholder surveys can provide immediate, in-depth information on relationships between stakeholders and transform the information into actionable intelligence. This will allow your team to respond more quickly to the shifts that we're all feeling. Patrick's going to get a lottery card tonight, huh?
some kind of lottery. Also, you're totally overestimating the amount of knowledge I have to share. So,
Hey, I
alas,
think anybody that leaves, there's
yeah,
always a gap of knowledge, right?
totally.
So yeah, let's continue down that line of thinking. So let's look at our third technique, which, hey, if we all kind of tuned out in high school pre-calculus, it is a-okay. But look, the matrix is back to haunt us many, many years later. So luckily, this is not pre-calc focused. But the interest to influence matrix, honestly, is the linchpin when it comes to your stakeholder mapping strategy. It's necessary to get the right message in front of the right person at the right time. But it's very easy to get this wrong. So I want to call out an example here. So a staffer, a swing vote staffer is rarely going to appear on the on the influence matrix, but they're often a key primary champion for determining an outcome for policy. Similarly, how we talked about mapping all of your stakeholders in one place and centralizing that data, constituents are a high power interest indicator. And let's use grassroots for an example. When grassroots and stakeholder data are connected, your interest axis updates automatically as your constituent contact changes. That right there is automating the stakeholder map in many ways. Because as we move to the fourth technique, what's very important to note is that this is an ever evolving flow. Tiers can and should change because they reflect actual behavior from these stakeholders. A common mistake that I often hear is when teams are treating these tiers as static or revamping the tiered system maybe once a year or before session and after session. These are meant to change, and that's really part of what makes the influence and interest matrix as successful. So let's say the tier 3 stakeholder just won a competitive primary, and now they chair a key committee that makes them not a tier 3 stakeholder anymore. That is probably going to bump them up to tier 2, potentially even tier 1. Because if we're looking at tiers, the high interest, high influence, and strong engagement is where you're going to focus your time. But the criteria has to be set in advance and not retroactively. This will help you build stronger and longer lasting stakeholders and relationships through time. Now let's think back to the question that I asked just a few minutes ago. Were you able to easily identify those tier 1 stakeholders that you had not had a recent touch point yet? If the answer was no, I'm wondering if a tiered system is up to date and if it's actually reflecting the behaviors. This is one of the most immediate use cases for AI developing your stakeholder strategy, because generating a priority engagement list on these contact gaps, so that 60-day window of no touch points or no communication, that's exactly where AI can come into the fold. So you can run a query. Which tier 2 stakeholders have I not logged a contact with in the last quarter? Then converting that into an auto-updated engagement list is, again, going to streamline the efficiency of a stakeholder map. And then you ultimately have more time back in your day because your data is correct, it's comprehensive, and it's operating in an always-on capacity. Let's look at our fifth and final technique, and then let's talk about it. So once you know where your stakeholders stand, you know what kind of outreach makes the most sense for them. Again, it's all about finding the right person at the right time and delivering the right message. So identifying stakeholder alignment categories is incredibly powerful, but, and it's a big but, it's only useful if those designations are current. So this is absolutely going to require action on your team's end. Very similar to our last technique. Many teams are updating these maybe once a session, once a quarter, potentially once a year, and that is not often enough. Consider an active crossover deadline period, and then you'll really understand where identifying who your tiered and who your champion stakeholders are. This really needs to be the most comprehensive, up-to-date relationships that you all have. So AI can make this sharper again, of course. We're going to take it several steps further, and it's all about meeting preparation and getting ahead of the conversation. So here is another best practice that I'll share with you all in 60 seconds to guarantee that your quality conversations will be enhanced. Before any meeting, run a query, pull past interactions with that office. What are their recent votes on impactful legislation? What is your organization's footprint in that district? What notes have any colleagues logged? And where that is going to drive a more impactful conversation is that it's going to separate productivity, net new information, rather than retreading the old ground. The matrix is reflective of any tiers, because tiers, and it's a good question in the chat, Brad. So any verbiage that your team uses, whether it's a tiered system, 1 through 4, tiers 1 through 3, champion, neutral, detractor, your influence and your influence matrix absolutely is reflective of how your teams are prioritizing your stakeholders. Excellent question. Now let's tie it together with a nice bow. So we're going to turn the map into a working system. So we're going to take the 5 strategies that we've just walked through, and I'm going to give you 2 key takeaways. If you are leaving this webinar saying, holy cow, I have 5 steps that I now have to follow, and what am I taking from this? I'm going to give you 2 takeaways. Number 1 is that it has to be consistent. So the data is only as good as what is entered into your system of record. Technology is not going to solve a logging problem, but the folks here on this call are. Leadership is setting the standard there. And so best practice is positioning the consistent logging with about a 24-hour window. So that's shifting the culture of where it is important to log those engagements. And there are multiple ways to do that. So it doesn't have to be, sit down and I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes logging all of my engagements in. There are absolutely easier and more effective ways to do that. And then the second commitment is where I have seen that most teams fall short. The data exists in a system, but nobody's querying it. These high stakes moments are happening. We saw that in the challenges that we discussed at the beginning of the call. We saw that with the statistics in our 2025 State of Government Affairs surveys. The answers are in the data. The data can be used, and the data can be used in a highly effective way, because now we are riding the innovation wave with AI. So review those tiered assignments, look at the engagement history before fly-in, query before we finalize crossover strategies, and use this data effectively, because they truly will help inform your decisions. And once we have these 2 down, everything else can be automated in a really nice framework for highly effective stakeholder management. Now, what does this look like in Quorum? So Quorum is absolutely the place where it can all live and operate seamlessly, utilizing our AI assistant that we have named Quincy. So this is where you can log your meetings and tag your stakeholders. You can tag stakeholders by issue area, by priority, by tiers, by champion detractor. And the idea is that it is customized and configurable based on your team's individual workflows. You can track legislative action at every single level, connect your PAC and your grassroots data, and then it is all queryable by Quincy. So back to our question at the beginning of our call, can we identify those tier 1 stakeholders? If the answer was no, not easily, then we would love to help walk through how you can set this as a standard for your team. And specifically, I would love to show you how we can do that. So now we'd love to open it up for questions. I know we've had some questions in the chat, but would love to hear thoughts, questions, or maybe even share any best practices that any of our attendees are open to sharing.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. So first question, had a few votes for it. How do I get people to actually log their notes in relationships? I think that's great. It's one thing to create the system. It's another thing to get people to adopt it. So you mentioned like the establishing that 24-hour window, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that you've seen work really well.
Yeah, absolutely. So automation of this, and honestly, we live in a world of AI, and there are agents that are coming out every single day to assist in this. So whether it is, just capturing an email that you're already sending directly to your Quorum system or your CRM, whether it is, getting a phone call and answering the call and logging that engagement through voice or utilizing voice to text when you're on the go. But honestly, it comes back to those key takeaways that we talked about. The data is only as good as what's in the system. So this really does have to be a top-down approach from leadership. This is where it is really going to be productive for there to be a standard across the organization using that 24-hour window as the baseline.
Totally. And I love what Justin just threw in the chat here. Depending on your team dynamics, using some friendly competition has helped our team by using dashboards to show numbers of notes interactions per team member. Man, I can tell you that really, really gets folks going. If they start seeing like, oh, I'm really falling behind. It looks like I'm not doing my job here. And meanwhile, Justin's absolutely killing it with all of his meetings. I really have to log my notes. We also talked about this a little bit at the AI Summit, which I thought was great, which was around once you start establishing that culture and people start seeing like star contributors or like they're really great people on your team that they know and respect, that they're actually logging their interactions, people will be a lot more likely to do it. And then using things like forwards at quorum.us to forward your emails that you have that are really important with folks is just a great way to like rack up those interactions to move up the scoreboard. And so once you get people starting to, find it a competition, like that's really when you start getting that, inertia building for teams.
Yeah. And what I like to say on conversations is that government affairs is a very qualitative job. It's qualitative work that you do, and it's nearly impossible to put the quantitative metrics behind that. And so, Justin, I especially love your comment about utilizing a dashboard to show the number of notes and engagements, because those are the quantitative metrics right there. And that's exactly how you can show ROI to the important work that you all are doing every single day, because conversations and relationships do matter. And so being able to show in aggregate, this is where I focused my efforts and this is what happened because of that, it really is so much more impactful than just, not having those metrics.
All right. Next question here, which is how often do people update their tiers? Yearly, quarterly, in the moment? It sounds like a lot to keep track of. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. And I think that the tiers could not necessarily need to be updated all at once every time. I think it's a really important nuance that during state sessions, as state legislators are championing bills or co-sponsoring high priority pieces of legislation, that could potentially move them up that tiered ladder of engagement. But let's say that the absence of impactful activity or influential or interest matrix movement, that would not necessarily necessitate a an immediate change of the tiers. But I think it is a little bit more ad hoc than at certain times of the legislative season. Of course, during elections, that's a really excellent time to relook at your tiers. During redistricting, during regulatory changes and pivots and moments of executive order implementation, those are excellent times to take a look at your tiers and ensure organizational alignment.
Totally. I also talked to some folks that said this is probably one of their most fun conversations they have as a team, is when they get together and they totally remap of saying like, okay, who should be tier 1 now? Who should be tier 2 now? And so they do it at least once a quarter to, and frankly, they're like, this is my chance to actually really shine, to be able to say, actually, no, I spoke to this person and I think they're a tier 1 based off of their, the things that they mentioned here. Let's see, because there's another question that came in around if we don't have, we know that voting is one important piece of like, what is their, did they vote yes on this bill? Did they vote no on this bill? We know that's important, but that's only about like 50% of the story. What are some of the other like soft data pieces that you can pull in to help map like who should be closer to tier 1, tier 2? I'll try to find that question and pull it up. But Maggie, what are your thoughts?
Wait, that's such a fun question. So I think back, and actually I kind of use the interest and influence matrix on my own, just kind of like as a school of thought, and would encourage you all to do the same as we talk through this question, because influence and interest can look very different. And interest, of course, could look like constituents that live in a district or highly engaged PAC members or grassroots advocates, but it could also look like social media contributions. It could look like somebody who's just active in their community. And so those interest factors absolutely should go into the influence element, because if you have high interest, there's better likelihood for higher influence, regardless of what the how we're setting the scene there, not always in a lawmaker capacity, but often for custom and organizational stakeholders too.
Totally. I think oftentimes, and then this is also kind of where like you step in, right? Because if a system was able to fully use all this data to create these tiers and to create that organizational priority of who to manage, what are we all doing here, right? So that's exactly where you can leverage your expertise and your applicability in order to show, like value to your team of saying like, okay, cool, this is all the data that's available, but I know that this person cares about this thing because we talked about it a year ago at the bar or something like that. Is all very, very important for you to be able to throw into your system. And those are important notes to log. All right, let's see. What question should we do next? All right, let's do this one. We don't really have detractors, and we don't want it to leak that someone is a detractor. So what recommendations do you have for number 5 based on that? That was the one that had like champion, neutral, detractor. What are your thoughts?
I love it, because I probably have this conversation once a week, if not more. Absolutely. So the beauty of Quorum is where I mentioned that configurability. So customizing that language that resonates with your organization. And I think I briefly mentioned it, but it's not always going to be tier 1, 2, 3. It's not always going to be champion, neutral, detractor. But you can configure the Quorum system so that you are ranking those influence or key stakeholders in an alignment that resonates most with your organization. So, of course, we wouldn't want that to, we wouldn't want you all to use detractor if that's not an internal category that you all use organically. So you have the ability to modify the alignment designations.
Yeah, so we can do like neutral, champion, super champion, or random, I don't know, something like that to throw on there.
Some clients actually use a knowledge-based system. So instead of champion, neutral, and detractor, it's a little bit more, it knows our issues. supports our issues and then unfamiliar with our issues. And then that is less on an influence scale, but rather how are they engaging with the content that we're sending out, and then moving up the alignment scale based on their outreach efforts with those stakeholders.
Totally. I really love this question. So we're going to keep going on it. The big thing, I love that you can easily show then the ROI of your program based off of that, of saying we have a goal of moving 30 people from don't know our program to knows about our program, and from the people who know about our program to are intimately familiar, or whatever the last one is. All right. Let's get to Stephanie's question here, which is, how do you track and map engagement when most of the org doesn't have CRM access? Or is it better to have a sort of cadence, and how do you build that from scratch?
Yeah, I saw this question in the chat, and Stephanie, I am so glad that you asked it, because that's very difficult. And I think it goes back to our activity of how do you find the tier one stakeholders if there is not a system of record like a CRM? So what our recommendation is of course integrating and centralizing that data. And what Quorum does exceptionally well is it includes a CRM, not only a government affairs CRM, but also an organizational CRM as well. So building that from scratch is many times it is just compiling the data that already exists in your day-to-day. So it's identifying those stakeholders and who is aligned with those stakeholders, how those stakeholders have previously voted on behalf of policies that the organization is in support of or opposition of. And once you set the framework, what we've talked a lot about in these 5 stakeholder mapping techniques is the automation of it all. So Stephanie, yes, there is going to be initial build out of that. And if you're considering using Quorum or are already partnered with Quorum, that is an effort that our teams are especially skilled at supporting in the implementation process. But the initial build out really shows returns long term because so much of it is automated when it is centralized in a system.
I love that. I love that. Having that all in one spot is super, super crucial. And also there's ways that you can do like external logging and stuff like that with Quorum. You just talk to your team, talk to your account manager, and ask around how you can get some external logging to get that stuff in the platform. All right, let's open up to another question from Danella Smith. Would it be possible to track legislation in New York City Council or other state localities?
Danella, of course it is. So in New York City, we do not track local ordinances, but we are capturing agendas, meeting minutes, and many other local committee meetings in our what we call documents data set. So you can keyword search, you can query through AI what is happening with the New York City Council. This also is inclusive of social media for the council stakeholders. This is going to be sort of keeping a pulse on what is happening in New York City Council. That's also including all other state localities with populations of 3,000 and above. So state and federal government affairs is absolutely critical. What we're seeing is that the local level is no different at all.
All right. All right. This next question here, we'll do another quick Quorum question, which is, does Quorum track news articles and can email notifications be enabled?
Absolutely. I love Danella. You have the excellent questions today. Yes, Quorum has comprehensive news monitoring as part of our system offerings. And email notifications, we call these alerts. So you can configure email notifications in any way, cadence, and frequency that you would like based on the data sets like the news articles that we have available to our clients.
All right. Great, great question. Let's go ahead and answer one here, which is, does every Quorum client have a walled garden for the info they're putting in the system, or is it the data from all clients being merged and used to create master files on legislators?
It is the former. So every single Quorum account is only designated for the individuals that are part of that team. So every Quorum instance is completely separate. We prioritize data security and data privacy above all else. So we are never using client data to inform our AI. We're never using client data to inform or share with other clients. This is your data. So Quorum is absolutely keeping the data together and centralized, but the answer is no, we are not merging all client data to create master files on legislators. They are isolated and protected in your individual environment.
Totally. All right, let's get to another question about data in Quorum. We've been trying to use this data to educate our PAC donors on why they should donate and why we donate to certain politicians. What can I make public from Quorum?
It's a really good question. So depending on the product configurations that you have, there are so many elements of Quorum that are externally accessible. So that means that stakeholders or PAC members can actually engage with the content as an external stakeholder. So for PAC specifically, you have a PAC action center. And for our grassroots clients and our stakeholder clients, you have what we call an action center. It's similar to a standalone website with individual calls to actions and engagement campaigns that your stakeholders can go into and understand, educate themselves, and then even go as far as taking action, whether it is by registering to donate to the PAC or taking a meaningful action through grassroots activity, call to action. It is really putting the responsibility and accountability onto your stakeholders. And then the Quorum users can track all of that engagement on the back end.
Totally. I love that. One of the things I heard a lot from at the National PAC conference earlier this month was oftentimes PAC donors, especially as like employee PAC donors that are younger, are thinking like, okay, our corporate PAC donates to this person and I hate that person. I am not going to donate to our PAC because it's just funneling money to that person. And one of the ways to get around that, or to help people understand the importance of their PAC, is by showing things like, okay, well, this person is actually really active on the things that impact our organization. So by being able to pull that up, being able to pull up that data to say, okay, well, this is how they voted in line with the things that really matter to our company. And here are the things that, they sit on these important committees and all that kind of fun stuff. And that's why they sit right here. And so being able to provide a little bit more of that information makes it easier for folks to be able to donate and feel good about it. All right. Do you have any good suggestions or examples or best practices for surveying stakeholders, whether within Quorum or not? Always love to learn what other Quorum clients are finding successful.
Yeah, Justin, this is an excellent question, and I would invite anybody to also share any best practices or suggestions in the chat if you'd like to. A few that I have seen work incredibly well is actually one of the functions that Patrick just referenced in our last Q&A response, is the external engagement logger. So again, putting the responsibility and kind of keeping the accountability alive and well with your stakeholders. External engagements and relationships are a natural kind of always on solution to solicit this information from your stakeholders. So for example, my sister-in-law is related to a legislator, a state legislator, and that's impactful information potentially for an organization to know or PAC to know. And that's really just kind of that low-hanging fruit. So I would absolutely leverage the external engagement logger because it takes the responsibility off of your team, Justin, and it's sort of an automated approach to fill those conversations and those relationships that are happening with your stakeholders.
Totally. I think oftentimes when you're surveying your stakeholders, there's they fall into two buckets. Like one bucket is, I want to know how to personalize my experience with this individual. Like, what is it about this specific individual that's going to help us either activate them further or to use their relationships and all that kind of fun stuff. And so having An external interaction logger is super helpful for that group. Doing the relationship mapping with that group is super helpful. Asking specific questions, maybe on your Action Center form, as people go to take action on a campaign, of asking them something like, how do you relate to our organization? Are you a parent? Are you somebody affected by this? Are you blah, blah, blah? How do you feel about XYZ? Asking those questions there. And then the other kind of data that you collect is, more of understanding your advocate base and the folks that you work with, at a more aggregate level. One of my favorite examples here, and sorry, Maggie, this is not a Quorum example, but one of the things I think is great, is somebody created a personality quiz, like a BuzzFeed style quiz. And in that BuzzFeed style quiz, it asked things like, what podcasts do you listen to? And they had to type in the podcast that they listened to, or they selected which ones. Or they, answered questions along the lines of like, how often do you read the news? Stuff like that, that helps you better understand your advocate base. And then it created like a different, it said like, you are a bird. I don't know what the personality example was. That one came to mind because I just took a BuzzFeed style quiz with a friend that was like, what bird are you? And I started out not at all interested. Why did you send this to me? And then by the end, I was like, if I'm not a penguin, I'm going to be really upset. But like those personality quizzes is a great way to understand your advocates in aggregate. And it's a fun way to engage them. So, all right. I was just so excited to share that one. But let's go ahead and answer this next question, which is, you mentioned the importance of following actors during elections. What type of information can Quorum gather on candidates that have not yet been elected or that are moving to another level of government?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and honestly, such a timely question, because we've recently rolled out our candidate data. So in the Quorum officials data set, you'll see all candidates and challengers, and it's already aligned with the broader government affairs CRM and the officials data set. So you will see all of the history of that individual candidate, whether they have served in statewide office, or maybe they are at the federal level, but potentially they're running for governor. All of that data is still integrated into the broader Quorum database so that you are able to make those informed decisions of how you are engaging with and reaching out to these candidates during election season.
Totally. All right. Next question from Pat Murray. Hey, Pat, I like your name. A great name. How do I use this for stakeholder engagement that is not centered around GR? Thinking government relations. I want a tool that helps with project development where we have landowners and neighbors for or against or neutral.
Yeah. Pat, it's a question I love. And the answer is you do it the exact same way that we do it in a government affairs capacity, because Quorum is, of course, a government affairs CRM, but that infrastructure of an organizational CRM would allow you and enable your team to upload those landowners and those neighbors and track meaningful engagements and tasks and outreach and follow-up items. And every step of the way that you're engaging with them and moving through projects, you're able to track and aggregate all of that data. And then, of course, at the end, you put a very nice bow over a beautiful visual dashboard that shows the ROI of the projects that you're working and your landowner support and opposition within those projects.
Totally. I love that. There's some folks who don't really use this at all for government relations. They just use this for public arts, right? So anything that they have, they can upload contacts into our system, just like any other CRM, and have those same engagement features. I love being able to see that, because oftentimes it's really cool where you do have a government affairs function or government relations function, and you have this other public affairs function, and then having all that data in the same place, so you can see, okay, how many contacts do we have in this person's district? If we can, so maybe we can tie those two together, all that kind of fun stuff to say, okay, we have all these champions in this district, we need to be utilizing that. So that's great. One reason to have all that data in one place. All right, let's do another AI question. Yeah. Speaking of AI, when does Quorum plan to roll out new AI features around mapping email, voice to the interaction fields, to the standard fields, and custom fields? I'm curious, Maggie, for the folks who stuck around on this webinar, there's a little over 100 of you. Are you able to share anything here around what's coming up?
Yeah. So what I would share is that we are always making advancements, especially around the AI and Quincy infrastructure. So, Quorum is excitedly riding that innovation wave and kind of moving into a more innovative territory. When it comes to logging effective engagements and operating in a more agentic way through your CRM and logging those engagements, I would invite all of our 100 plus folks that are on the call to stay tuned in the next couple of weeks because we may have some interesting announcements coming.
Yeah, I was about to say I might get my hand slapped for putting that question up there. But I'm really excited about these things just because, like we were talking about earlier, like so many folks, and this is always been a struggle, at least for me, when it comes to like logging my expenses, right? Anytime I have to log something, there's a barrier to get over that. And so we're thinking really critically in our workshopping some things, especially with our customers, to figure out what is the easiest way to get those things logged so you can maintain that record. I think we've done a lot of great stuff with our mobile app with forwards, but there's some other really, really cool things that we can do when it comes to logging interactions. All right. Let's go ahead and answer this question here. Maggie, you've been fantastic just knocking out these questions for the past 30 or so minutes.
Thanks.
Anybody else has any other questions, feel free to throw it in the Q&A. Maggie is a wealth of knowledge, works with hundreds of customers and has a chance to chat with these folks about what are the things that they're facing and brainstorming ways that you can solve it with technology in and outside of Quorum. So be sure to use these next 5 minutes to ask any of your questions. Here's a question around Quorum. Does Quorum work with keyboard shortcuts, screen readers, and other assistive technologies?
It does. We are Section 508 compliant.
Love to hear it. Love to hear it. Those things make a massive difference. Absolutely massive difference. All right. Maggie, when you talk to folks, I'm curious, what is the thing that you get the most excited about when they come into a call to say, like, here's the thing that I've been struggling with? Like, what is the thing that once you hear this thing, you're like, oh my gosh, you're about to like lose your mind?
Yeah. So I always say that my love language is grassroots advocacy. And before I joined Quorum about 7 years ago, I was actually in the government affairs industry for many, many years before that. And where the conversations that I absolutely geek out on are new and developing grassroots advocacy programs and functions. So part of my background, I was with a utility company and there was not a grassroots advocacy function. And so myself and a couple other teammates built a statewide grassroots advocacy program and then scaled it to 6 different states before I ultimately transitioned from that organization to Quorum. And so the conversations about best practices around launching and scaling grassroots advocacy programs are my favorite conversations to have. But honestly, I mean, Quorum is such an advanced tool, and it is something that is so necessary for every single individual, whether you're in the grassroots or government affairs space, or whether, like Pat, you're in the landowner and project management space. There's absolutely something that is going to impact and drive efficiencies in every single person's day-to-day. And so that's really where I come into play, is unlocking what are those efficiencies and where can we help map out a stronger workflow for our clients.
Totally. I love that. All right, we have another great question from Pat here, which is, I may have missed the tag conversation. Is that how we would organize our stakeholders by project? E.g., look up project ABC, all landowners with infrastructure. I'm curious what your thoughts are on tagging in specific projects.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Pat. So there's actually multiple ways of tagging. And we did talk in our slides about the naming conventions of the organization. So absolutely tagging by project. This is actually a use case. I have supported other clients in the landowner and project management space, actually, And we utilize a function of Quorum called issue management. And that can be a project centralized function. We think of it as like a virtual filing cabinet in Quorum. And so then tagging all relevant stakeholders, all of the impactful engagements and relationships, and then also the representatives of that district. Maybe we're also tracking community sentiment on social media and tagging it all into one singular project portfolio, if you will, absolutely helps when it comes time to reporting and understanding the impact of the different stages of those projects.
Totally. I love that. All right. Pat also had another question about existing stakeholder lists. Can you upload them? You absolutely can upload them. There is a bulk upload feature. It's pretty easy just to drop in the CSV and let it do its work.
Well, Pat, I think we should have a custom call after this. I think we should get you taking a look at Quorum. Excellent questions. And for everybody that has submitted questions, thank you all so much for your engagement. I mean, these questions have been fantastic, and we hope that they have been very, very helpful.
Totally. All right, y'all. With that, we'll go ahead and end it here. If you have any other questions on how folks are doing stakeholder engagement, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to answer those, especially Maggie. She's like the real, she knows all this kind of stuff. Like I mentioned, she's talked to how many different organizations on how they're doing this. So she's always a very great person to talk to about this. Thank you so much, Maggie, for joining us and sharing all your great info here and mapping out those 5 different techniques and answering everybody's question. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and being so active in the chat and Q&A. That's been really fantastic. Check out the Docs tab to see those slides if you want to learn a little bit more about Stakeholder, and please join us in Wonk Nation. And until the next webinar, hope y'all have a great day. See y'all.
Thanks, everybody.